Hello, everybody. Oh, yeah, I'm not gonna do that. Welcome to our next episode of the Hourglass. I'm Sernan Harma or Chris, um, and we would love to talk to you guys about the Islamic conquest happening between the years 600 AD and 750. Give or take a decade or two, some of the discussions might go a little before or a little after. So please bear with us, as history is always as fluid and moving. Joining with us tonight, we have two individuals who are sitting right above me, and I'll let them introduce themselves.
Hi, everybody. I am Laura or Feline. I have a master's degree in linguistics and a love of Islamic culture. It's one of the many things that I fell in love with while I was getting a degree in religious studies as well. I'm really excited to be talking about the cultural aspect of Islam as well as all of the wonderful things it has given us in our day to day lives, even today.
Okay, I'm Trevor, aka Lobo, and I'm currently in my second year MA program at the University of Cincinnati for history. And I came here with a background in Middle East history, and my minor's in Middle East studies. And my current focus in graduate school is Orientalism. And that's basically just because I had to narrow it down because I have such a broad interest in the Middle East that it became difficult to even narrow it down to one particular thing. So I'm very excited to be here and taking part in this discussion.
So, one of the hardest parts to nail down, especially when you talk about the Islamic conquest and really anything happening in the Middle Ages, especially the early Middle Ages, you run into the problem of source material. From a biography, from a guy who knew a guy, you might get something entirely different than what actually happened. We have to rely on as few sources as many sources as we can, and some of those tend to be very dubious in quality. And we've talked many times over every episode about how our source material can change in quality and quantity rather rapidly. The Muslim conquest, or sorry, the Islamic conquest in the 600s is almost no different. As we'll discuss later on, the story of Muhammad and his life and the early days of the Arabian Peninsula, especially pre-Islam, is very hard to nail down. And we will talk more about that. One of the biggest things that we want to emphasize here is that there's a lot of things that we know, there's a lot of things that we think we know, and there's a lot of things that we'll never know. And so, as always, we ask you to always have a slight amount of skepticism to anything you read or hear. Do your own research as much as humanly possible. We are here to convey what we think we know, or we're pretty sure we know. And with that, I'm going to lead it over to source material. So, if Feline would like to give us her sources that she will be using for tonight.
Oh, okay. Let me
Or
pull that
what's
list
your
up.
main source? Do you have one in
Um,
particular?
okay, so there's two books that I love to quote all the time. One is called Discovering God by Rodney Stark. It is kind of thick. It is definitely one of the books that I used earlier on in my career it's really meaty. It's hard to get through sometimes, but he is very, very thorough in covering a lot of different topics and a lot of different viewpoints. My only complaint with him is he primarily tends to come from a Judeo-Christian perspective, whether he realizes it or not. So that's definitely one of those. You want to take that with a grain of salt. A lot of that is reflections on cultures as seen from their neighboring cultures. The other book that I um, usually like to talk about with Islam is the Fred Donner book called The Early Islamic Conquest. A lot of military history in that one. It's very fun to read. Um, those are my two main sources that we're going to be using tonight. And yeah, those are mine.
All right.
And for me, oh, did you want to go, Chris?
No. Go ahead.
Oh, okay. For me, it's just one primary source, or one not primary, but a main source. The primary source is actually something from the period itself. My main source is the New Cambridge History of Islam, Volume 1. There are several volumes to this, and the in the New Cambridge tradition, they'll make these volumes of history for any particular period or region every few years or so. They get together with every leading scholar in the field, bring them together to collaborate on this volume, and it's edited by Chase F. Robinson, but it's written by several different leaders in scholarship in the Islamic world. And I use volume 1 because it covers the period that we're discussing, or at least part of the period that we're discussing.
Yeah, my main sources are that I've used the most is probably Decline and Fall of I always mess up his name, Sasanian Empire, the Sasanian Parthian Confederacy, and the Arab Conquest of Iran by Pavea Porshati. I'm gonna butcher that name. And then the Arabia and the Arabs from the Bronze Age to the Coming of Islam by Longman in 1986. So a little bit older sources, but we will be publishing or putting up the entirety of our bibliography that we are using for those that are interested and want to do more of their own individual research, which I always recommend. All right. We are moving here into the meat of our session. So, as always, when you're talking about a major event in history, you want to talk about the pre-existing conditions that allowed these things to take place. So we need to kind of paint for you a broad spectrum of how the world looked on the eve, probably around the year 600, possibly even the late 590s during this time frame. And Lobo, you want to kick us off?
Sure, no problem. I just want to emphasize that pre-Islamic Arabia is scarce in narrative and sources, so most of it's reliant on later Muslim writings of the period. So the historiography of the 6th and 7th century is mixed at best. So we do the best we can, as you said. And the pre-Islamic Arabian Peninsula was a relatively marginal zone, mostly impoverished, politically unstable in comparison to their Syrian, Iraqi, and Egyptian counterparts. And I use Syrian, Iraqi, and Egyptian just for familiarity. It was really Byzantium and Persia that had control over these areas. But the instability of the peninsula was partly brought on by the frequent intervention of the neighboring powers. And Syria and Iraq during late antiquity were areas of mass commerce, trade, and movement. There were tons of trade routes and infrastructure, and a lot of exchange and communication connecting Persia to the Mediterranean. And the land was also heavily exploited and cultivated for resources. And the peninsula itself was caught between these two great empires, but it also had strategic significance as a source of trade and resources. The semi-nomadic populations of the northern peninsula were occasional bandits, mercenaries, and traders for both empires. And the commercial centers of the southern peninsula were also important trading hubs. And the Quraysh tribe became one of the more prominent traders in Mecca, but we'll get to them later. And the population was nomadic, semi-nomadic, and settled, but they were all tribal with rich oral traditions. And the historical attention given to their military activities of the nomads or the Bedouins has led to an unrealistic perception of what the society was actually like. And while Mecca and Medina were considered the most prominent cities, there were in fact several towns just as wealthy, if not more so. So it wasn't this lawless and wild land, and people were often bound by unwritten societal laws. And tribes were cooperative with one another, and a complex legal system, including documentation, was in place in the region before Islam. So the nomadic and settled populations were very cooperative in both as a society and in wartime. And the pre-Islamic Arabs were also united by their love of poetry. And the Kaaba was a place of pilgrimage, often during holy months when hostilities were ceased. And the idol worshippers themselves were polytheists. But they also believed in a high god they called Allah, whose house was in the Kaaba, who had supremacy over tribal deities. And idol worship prevailed despite the presence of Judaism and Christianity. For example, all Meccan homes had idols in them. And the Persians were heavily invested and involved in the peninsula. They even had control over the eastern and southern coasts in some parts, while Byzantium they were very active throughout the Red Sea. And they were very interested in Arabian affairs, mostly through the buffer kingdoms of Ghassan in Syria and Al-Hira in Iraq. And there was also a lot of overlap geographically and politically. Arab tribal leaders and merchants became very familiar with the political workings of the empires through the interactions through these buffer kingdoms. And there was a lot of exchange that took place along the permeable boundaries. It was a highly complex and wealthy late Roman world. And that's about the general idea of the pre-Islamic.
We had two questions for you, Lobo, come in from the
Sure.
audience. One asks, do those areas have names before the states of Syria and Iraq exist? I've only heard Mesopotamia and the Nineveh plains. Do we have any, obviously with the fluidity of states in the region, do we have any particular terms we can nail down for that region during this time frame?
That's why I'm using Syria and Iraq, because they're really broken down into cities. Like they would just the empires would consider them part of their general sphere of influence, if that makes sense.
And then the other question was the polytheistic Arabic religion related to any other mythologies like the Akkadian or the Canaanite?
That I don't know. Um, I do know that there were several deities. The land was there were a lot of influences coming in. That's why Mecca was so important. You had Jew, uh, Jews coming in, Christians coming in, and all these polytheists, and they're all interacting with one another at the same time, and you get a lot of overlap. And it's really hard to pin down how many different deities there were and what they were influenced by, because we have to go by the sources that were given. Like I said before, it's written by Muslims that came later, so who knows what was left out and the realities of the situation.
So on Persia, or the Sassanid Persians, because they are separate, they had a major rival in the region, major political rival in the region, was just Byzantium, or as they would prefer to be called, the Romans. Byzantium is a name read back through history. It's an acronym, or sorry, it's a description. In around the year 600, they had, as Loba had previously mentioned, a lot of internal problems and external problems. Matter of fact, they did actually annex a portion, a kingdom that actually bordered in a lot of Arabia called you're going to have to help me on that one, the pronunciation, Lakamid? Lakamid?
Lakmid.
Thank you. And he was put to death by the Persian Emperor Khosrow because of a false suspicion of treason. This sets off a series of events that a prominent historian by the name of Michael Gregory Morant runs, that it was actually these cascading events that allowed a lot of the problems that they had had with the Romans at this time to expand and break apart. Our common perception of empires at this time are one cohesive state. That is not the reality of the Sassanids. And in her book, Prevea mentions that actually it's closer to a confederacy. And so when we imagine the Sassanid Empire's response to the Arab incursions, we imagine one unified front. They were unified loosely. They still paid homage to each other, but they were not one overarching power. And that was actually the reality for a lot of empires at this time. They also had just finished the Third Perso-Turkic War. They had been fighting with the Romans, as I had said, throughout most of the 6th century. And then the last little bit before the Arabs come knocking in is that king that I mentioned earlier, King Khosrow II, was actually executed, beheaded in 628, and this leads to an extremely damaging civil war between 10 claimants to the throne between 628 and 632. And just for those of you who are keeping track of years, the Arabs attacked literally the next year. the surviving ruler had barely any time at all to get successful integration with his policies before the Arabs came knocking in. And we'll move further east here, or sorry, west here, and I think Lobo wants to talk about Levant and Egypt.
Okay, I'm not muted. So I don't really have a lot to say there. Yeah, what I want to say about them takes place after the conquests are over.
Okay. Then I guess unless anyone has any problems, I'll just keep moving through.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So to bring up briefly the other player, which is Byzantium, as we mentioned before, they had actually their own internal problems. Again, they had been fighting with the Sassanids for off and on throughout their entire existence. But the plague, the Justinian plague, or what we think is bubonic plague at this time, had been taxing their manpower and infrastructure. Also, their Justinian's excursions in the western half of the Mediterranean, mainly his war against the Lombards and the attempt to recapture the West, overtaxed the empire. And so by nearly when you get all the way up into the 620s, they're nearly falling apart. They're actually attacked by a combination of the Persians, Avars, and even Slavic allies at this time, and they barely survive. And actually, they're pushed all the way out of Asia Minor and collapse down mostly to Constantinople itself. And in the 620s, it is surrounded again, but due to some funky maneuvers by Emperor Heraclius, he eventually does a flanking maneuver and saves his butt. But it cannot be understated the shock that these two empires had felt right up into the thing. And really quickly, to briefly go over it, Europe at this time, you're talking about the 600s, you're talking about the barbarian kingdoms still exist around this time, the Visigoths, Ostrogoths, and the Vandals. They are maintaining some Roman infrastructure and ways of life, but overall, you're actually in an era of severe depopulation in Europe, and they are collapsing inward as the Arabs about to spring outward. So now that we've set the stage, unless anyone else has any thing they'd like to throw in, we're going to move over to talking about Arabia itself and its Muhammad days that Lobo had briefly touched on earlier.
Am I on deck again?
Yep, you're
Okay.
pre-Muhammad Arabia.
Okay. All right. So the first Islamic century began in 622 with the Hijra from Medina to Mecca. But I think Feline, you wanted to mention Muhammad. You had
Yeah, just touching base, as we're fond of saying, very quickly. Again, covering the culture that was going on in this part of the Arabian Peninsula. Most of the population is located down south in the southwest, where Yemen is today, and along the western coast of what is now Saudi Arabia in an area known as the Hijaz. So this area, still to this day, is one of the most densely populated portions of the Arabian Peninsula. So it's always been populated. Trade was conducted by the nomadic people, like we were talking about, the Bedouins. They're known colloquially as the Bedouins. There's really no evidence that they were called this during that time, but it's an easy term for us to use now because, for the most part, there's a cultural history there that we can trace back with fair regularity. So I think it's safe to just use the term Bedouins to refer to the nomadic people that were in Saudi Arabia at the time, or I should say the Arabian Peninsula. Don't forget about Yemen. It's very important.
and Oman.
The Bedouins were a fiercely tribal people. They settled disputes and they made agreements through ranking male members of the group, so definitely patrilineal. But while they employed the patrilineal descent system, membership was really easy to gain or lose. If you had a trade agreement with somebody, you could get included in their clan. If you had a disagreement with somebody over a trade agreement, you could get removed from their clan. Usually blood ties were a little bit stronger, but they weren't necessarily a guarantee. And it's a really hardcore us versus them mentality, which I don't know if you're paying attention to the Middle East, but it's still pretty common today that you'll have that sense of othering as a way to protect oneself and one's family members from outside damage or outside dangers.
Whatever do you
So,
mean?
right? They're far from the only culture to do it, but it's definitely a very strong note that flows through Middle Eastern culture, particularly at this time. And that's going to come into play later when Muhammad starts setting up the core tenets of Islam and using that us versus them mentality to actually build a really strong sense of belonging that's been very difficult for outsiders to truly understand. So going from that mentality to the reason why they need it, if you think about the desert and the harsh conditions that you're in, it's better to have a really strong network of people in multiple different places that can offer different types of goods and services at different times of the year. So if you're in a drought in one part of your trade network, other parts of the trade network can pick up on that shortage. So that's one really good reason why that tribal mentality worked at that point in time, and one reason why it was so easy to exploit in the end. So the urban centers, Lobo talked a little bit about the Kaaba. That's the term that's used for a meteorite that fell from Earth that was supposedly sent by the god Allah, not ALLAH, as in the modern view of the Islamic god. I think it's AL-A. It's a different spelling, and the initial god definitely fell within the polytheistic pantheon. What, did I just forget a word? Pantheon? Sorry. The polytheistic I'm just gonna give up. That's it. I'm going home. Um, all right. So the polytheistic gods, um, they almost all of them had like a oasis that was dedicated to them. Mecca just happened to have this meteorite, which is why the oasis happened. The meteorite landed, and everybody's like, "Hey, that's really cool!" And there was water, and they're like, "Let's make a town." So it was a really, really important religious place for the polytheistic traditions at the time. And that's one of the main reasons why it was so important and so popular. People would go to this place, they would worship their god. Um, and then, like, trade has to happen. There's got to be religious deities. If you know anything about the world history ever, in the history of ever, you know that people that perform religious services charge money for them because that's how things work. So it was a very rich town, Mecca was, and that's where Muhammad was born. He was born to the Quraysh tribe. I always mispronounce it. I apologize.
Quraysh.
Quraysh. Thank you. It was the tribe that controlled Mecca and the access to the meteorite, which they called the Kaaba, like we mentioned earlier. Um, so, with all the religious importance, the specific tribe made their money and fame from the governance of the town itself. They did have religious members that performed services and ceremonies, but they were kind of more on the definitely more on the governance side of things, the bureaucratic side. That's the word that I'm looking for. So Muhammad was like minor nobility in Mecca when he was coming up. Um, and that's like really super wealthy. Um, do we want to start talking about
Yeah,
the found?
he was orphaned though at a young age, wasn't he?
Um, yeah, I think his parents died when he was young, but he was adopted by his uncle Abu Bakr, who's going to come back later on in the story. Um,
Always does.
and he always does. It's always the uncle. I'm not shit talking Abu Bakr, please. I'm not. Um, yeah, but for the most part, he was very wealthy and very well taken care of. He did not have hardships in his life. Um, do we want to talk about anything else before we start talking about the spread of Islam?
Uh, so you go over light. Uh, so like is the spread from him himself or as an
Yeah.
overall? Yeah.
So like we're not going to discuss Muhammad's visions or why necessarily he made Islam. That's not really the target of our discussion tonight. That is a huge topic, and it's one that's really I don't think that I'm qualified to have it. So I'm excited we're not actually going to be talking about it, but we do have to point out that at some point Muhammad felt he had visions and he started preaching of a new religion that was monotheistic. There were already monotheistic religions in the region. We've talked about Christianity and we've talked about Judaism, which can be considered the heart of monotheism in at least that part of the world for sure. And a lot of people will argue that these are all derivatives of the same religion. Sometimes they even argue that themselves. There's a really good book called Discovering God, or God is Not One, by Stephen Prothero, who is still teaching, I think, at Boston. And I love him. I love everything he writes. And he talks about how even though they kind of all have the same blueprint, they're not the same religion. So while we're approaching this discussion as, yes, we have to admit that Islam is a religion and it does have a lot of similarities to Christianity and Judaism, the goal of the religion is not the same as the other two Abrahamic religions. So when we're discussing them and when we're like analyzing the sorts of things that they're doing in Islam, we kind of have to step back from that Judeo-Christian viewpoint and understand that what's going on might not necessarily make sense to us from our background, but it definitely made sense to the people that were doing it at the time.
So,
And I think,
go ahead.
sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, so to pivot off that, there is a couple similarities for those that may not know, and differences, key differences, because you have to remember that religions or theologies like uh, Islam or Christianity or Judaism goes through periods of evolution. They evolve or change slowly over a period of time. Whether it's they get scholars and philosophers get to weigh in on texts, or if new individuals show up with new information. So Muhammad's views on Christianity and Judaism are actually in the Quran itself. Because you have to remember that Islam means submission. Submission to who? Submission to Allah. That is what you're submitting to. Or a Muslim is one who submits. He does describe the Jews and the Christians as peoples of the book. And he believes that they did indeed receive divine inspiration. However, what they received was incomplete or partial. He does throw great amounts of respect towards Abraham, and I'm not going to attempt to pronounce his Arabic name in there. And actually, there is a religious, I don't want to use the term festival, but religious day that's devoted to Abrahamic notice. Some similarities between Islam and Christianity, for example, real quick, is they believe in the last judgment of all souls or all people and the resurrection of the body. The similarities between Islam and Judaism run a little bit deeper. Circumcision is required. Ritual prohibition to certain foods. Like an example that everyone's aware of is pork. The structure itself also has some aspects. Christians have priests that serve as an intermediary between Christians and their God, or and the God, and are able to administer the sacraments. In Judaism and in Islam, there is no priest. Instead, you have scholars or rabbis in case of Jewish law, or clerics. These are not priests. These are there to interpret and to communicate and to help you receive an understanding of it. This does evolve later. There are later iterations of this, but at the time around his death and just before his death, this is where you evolve into. Unbeknownst to a lot of people, the Quran actually makes multiple mentions of the Old Testament and the New Testament. It's the Tawrat, Tawrat, is the mention for the Jewish Torah, and the Indijil, if anyone wants to pronounce that for me, is the version that they use to talk about the Gospels. So it is very important for us to recognize and realize that these religions were all aware of each other, and they do interact with each other heavily. Muhammad knew of Judaism, Muhammad knew of Christianity, and they do interact. But we'd never want to get stuck in the path of thinking that the religion that Muhammad says is revealed to him is the religion as exists today. We want to be very careful about that, and I want to be very upfront about that, because Islam does change very quickly over the next succeeding centuries. And so with that, we'll leave the theology aside unless anyone else has any more input um, on that. Anyone have any other input on that?
Yeah, just I'll go ahead, Flying.
Well, I have this whole section to talk about diversity and objectives and beliefs that this might be actually a good place to talk about that to transition into what happens post founding of Islam. But if you have something else to say, Lobo, go for it.
Yeah, just theologically speaking, I'll just be brief. Like Jesus is mentioned more times in the Quran than in the Bible, and he's considered a prophet in the Islamic tradition, and on equal, like they still believe in the divine birth and everything like that. And Jesus and Moses and all the other figures that came before, like Noah as well and Abraham, like you mentioned, are all prophets in the Islamic tradition, and Muhammad is just a seal of the prophets. He is the last prophet. There will be no more prophets after Muhammad, according to Islamic tradition. But that's all I
Really
was going
good
to add
point.
to that.
That's going to tie in really, really nicely when we start talking about the iconoclasts. Fun words. So continuing on the discussion of the differences between Islam and other religions going on at the time, some of the things that made Islam so effective in this area was the fact that Muhammad didn't try to usurp the established social order. He tried to adjust it more towards his belief. So he wanted to bring all of the tribal people under one banner. Before, it was each of the different tribes had its own leadership, and it was kind of a loose conglomeration, but tribes were just as likely to kill each other as they were to help each other, depending on who needed what at any given point in time. And Muhammad wanted to unite everybody. So a lot of scholars have well, I'm not going to say a lot. Some of the scholars that I've read over the years have suggested that this was a direct response to the rise of Islam and Judaism in the region. That's definitely an interesting discussion to have. Why exactly did Muhammad feel threatened enough to create Islam? And that's just a Western interpretation of the reasons for him having his visions. Again, this is just interpretation. This isn't necessarily what happened. But that would definitely be a good conversation to have. Is jealousy a possible motivation for the creation of Islam? Possibly. Is jealousy a possible motivation for the creation of Christianity? Also very likely. Those aren't conversations we're going to have tonight because that'll take a long time, but it's definitely a thought to chew on.
Yeah, quick question, Feline. I did
Yes.
mean to, that we had just gotten in is, do you know how, or this is also open up for Lobo, how did Muhammad feel about Zoroastrianism as another generally monotheistic religion that's also right next door?
I know they're not considered people of the book. That much is to be sure. I don't even know if they're mentioned in the Quran. To be honest, I think most of their interaction was with Jews during the reign of Cyrus, and it's theorized that the dichotomy within Zoroastrianism about good versus evil influenced Judaism.
Yeah, I see that more of an influence on the western side of the Mesopotamian region, the eastern side more towards Pakistan than the Saudi Arabian Peninsula. So I don't know that I've ever come across any research in relation to Zoroastrianism and Islam. That's certainly an interesting question, though.
No, definitely. I mean, I'm sure the Zoroastrians were present in Mecca,
Oh, for
considering
sure.
its location and all the interaction. I've one class I took. It was theorized that the Quran was heavily influenced by the Ethiopian uh, version of Christianity, and a clue to this is in the Quran itself, where Jesus, as a baby, stands up and starts talking and presenting himself as a prophet, which is what happens in the Ethiopian Bible as well.
Oh, that's cool. I didn't know that.
Yeah, the early belief structures of Christianity and is pretty wild place.
That's cool. Any other questions?
Nope, we're green for now.
Okay. Are you getting those through Twitch? Because they're on like a 45-second delay.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Well, yeah. Any more questions? If anybody has any questions while we're going, throw them up on the Twitch. I don't. Is anybody watching the Facebook group?
I messaged. mm, No, I
Okay.
I will now.
Okay. Well, I was gonna say we're just gonna focus on Twitch. That's it.
Yep.
Okay. Back to Islam in the early ages. We're still not even in Islam yet. We're still in the tribal. Oh wait, no, we are up to Islam.
No, we're at Islam.
Yeah, I lost myself in my notes.
We have exited the
Um.
bus to Islam.
Okay.
'Cause
Cool.
you were mentioning Muhammad's.
Tribalism.
You're mentioning his motivations, and
Yes.
eventually he gets kicked out of Mecca. But
He
continue.
does. 13 years he preaches in Mecca. He falls back on the polytheistic God, the Allah, that he then transforms into the one true God, which I think was really smart on his part, because if you take something that people are already going to give divine authority to, and you say, give this all of your divine authority, there are no other gods, people are going to be like, weird, but okay. There is a big meteorite in town. Sure, sounds legit. Um, so he restructured Allah as the ultimate authority instead of the head of the tribe. And then he didn't remove the head of the tribe. He just shuffled it down a little bit. So he put, Allah, and then he put the prophets, and then he put the head of the tribe. So everybody was still kind of in the position that they normally were. There was just a couple extra positions towards the top. So that also allowed him to kind of slip in to the culture that was going on in Mecca. Um,
Are you referring to sheikhs when you say head of the tribe?
yeah, that would be like a colloquial term that we could use. It was a little more loose at that time. I believe it was more to do with religious authority and less your bloodline, if that makes sense. I don't have a good way to describe it, so we're gonna go with yes.
Yep.
Head of the tribe, the sheiks. Um, so in line, oh, I got lost in a tangent. I'm sorry. So the hierarchy was really effective at controlling the community, particularly once their numbers started to swell. And then we'll find out a little bit later that it also leads to major conflict, particularly when the head of the entire pyramid, it's not a scheme, it's a business. The head of the entire pyramid gets cut off. What happens? Who takes that pyramid's head's place? We're going to discuss that because that's not a problem you come into with the tribal situation. There's a clear line of inheritance, but there's not that clear line in Islam, and it gets into some trouble. One of the things that Muhammad did step away from that was pretty common in this part of the world was the idea of retribution, an eye for an eye, a hand for the hand, that sort of thing. Muhammad actually was more likely to push for mercy, and he suggested monetary compensation before bloodshed for certain crimes. Obviously, the big ones, yeah, you're probably getting stoned to death, but if you steal a loaf of bread, you're probably not going to lose your hand anymore. So that was more in line with the less popular people, or the less prosperous people, I should say, in town that were committing these petty crimes that were losing arms and limbs from. So that was another way that he endeared himself to the people. Like I said, he was in Mecca for 13 years preaching his new religion. And since he was a member of a higher up tribe, they weren't going to immediately kick him out because he had a lot of money and he had a lot of wealth and he had a lot of political position within the community. So they couldn't just be like, GTFO. So it took him 13 years of constant assassination attempts and just treating him like crap to get him to be like, fine, screw you guys, I'm leaving. So he leaves Mecca, and he relocates to Medina, which was called something else at the time. I made a note on it so I wouldn't forget, because I always forget. It was called Yathrib, and then he moves his people there and they rename it Medina, which means the city of the prophet. So they come in, they take over, they're like, this is our city now. They rename it and it becomes the seat of Islam for a while. He will
For
go back
10,
to Mecca,
10
but I
years.
don't want to spoil it yet.
Oh, sorry. Sorry.
Spoiler
No,
alert! Come
it's
on.
okay. Spoiler alert. What else did I have? I don't think I have anything else of particular. Oh, they did go back to Mecca, And when they went back, he spared everybody except for the 10 people that were like the absolute worst to him. He definitely killed them publicly, but everybody else he spared. So he's like getting everybody primed for this idea of a merciful, more peaceful religion. Yeah. So that's the early days of Islam.
I have a few things. So it's theorized that the Quran, any parts of it that refer to law or I guess law or structure were written while he was in Medina, because Medina was sort of the testing ground for Islam as a structure, as a system, not just of prophecy. And it was sort of this testing ground. That's where you get call to prayer, you get the 5 pillars, you get how people should act in public and in private, and all the different codified laws that come about. And it's theorized that while he was in Medina, and he was sort of the governor of Medina during this period, that's where you get that's where you get the Islamic laws from, the basis of them anyway. I mean, more come later, but through hadiths and so forth. But shall we move on to the Hijra now in 622?
Yes,
You
go
want?
for it.
Yeah.
Unless you have any more for line before we get to
No,
the
I don't
Hijra.
have any more.
Okay, so this is the first Islamic century in 622. That's why their calendar is a little bit different, and it's also a lunar calendar, which is why every year, oh god, the holidays fall in different months every year during different months. Sometimes they'll be in the middle of winter, sometimes the middle of summer. But it began in 622 with the Hijra from Medina to Mecca, where Muhammad and his followers could worship freely, and he stayed in Mecca until his death in 622. And as I said before, it was in Medina that Muhammad transformed Islam into a highly organized religious movement for radical reform. One God was to be the order of the earth. It was achieved through a highly effective political apparatus built on taxation and equally effective military campaigns. The conquests of the 640s and 650s would follow this model. So the authority came from God to the prophet, or the caliph, and then to the ruler that carried out the functions of the ruling empire under the Islamic model. And this is when Islam became more militarized during the Hijra and during the years in Medina. And it stemmed from the threats that Muslims faced in Medina and from Mecca, and from a desire to take Mecca back and make it the site of worship. So taking up arms in the name of belief was part of the tradition until the disengagement of this practice with the advent of professional armies under a state apparatus. So when we talk about jihad and holy war, it was both a reaction to the reality of the situation that Muslims faced at the time, but also it wasn't unique to Islam. If I could just divert a little bit, the 7th century was the time of holy war in many places, including Byzantium, where the Emperor Heraclius was campaigning in Armenia and Iraq, nowadays Iraq, on behalf of Christ and God.
Yeah, the Armenian and the Assyrian Christians at this time were also very active against the Persians, I believe. Or is that the Turks?
That'd be the Persians.
Persians.
Turks hadn't quite made headway yet into the region.
Did you want to talk about the Ridda Wars and the rise of Abu Bakr?
Oh, with the rightly guided caliphs? Sure. So Muhammad died in 622. I'm sorry, 632. My mistake. The
Spoilers.
Hijra. 632 is when Muhammad died, and all of Arabia wasn't quite under the Islamic banner just yet. And it was in danger of falling apart because he was now dead. There was no prophet to lead the Muslims anymore. And there was a discussion about who should succeed Muhammad, as no one could be prophet, but now that you could have a caliph. And Muhammad was both the first prophet, or both the prophet and the caliph. So he was the first caliph, and it fell to And there was a debate among Muslims about who should succeed Muhammad. Should it be someone who is as pure as Muhammad, someone who's as religiously um I don't know what I'm trying to say here. Rightful, I guess to be a rightful guided caliph. Is this person rightfully guided? It came, but and then there was also people that debated whether it should be someone who's from Muhammad's family. And there was never I mean, there's still debate to this day about what actually happened. The Shia Muslims will say that Muhammad did pick a successor, and Sunnis say that he did not, and then it fell to the Muslims themselves to pick the successor. Ultimately, the successor became Abu Bakr, which was, as Feline mentioned earlier, Muhammad's uncle. And Shias would say at the time, and it wasn't quite a Shia movement yet, but there were Muslims that supported Ali, who was Muhammad's nephew, not by blood, but through marriage. He married one of Muhammad's daughters. And then there becomes a debate about bloodline later when Ali has kids. And that leads to the further divide between Shia and Sunni about who should be the rightly guided caliph. And Ali was eventually a caliph. He was the fourth one, however. So he came much later than Abu Bakr.
All right. With that, before we dive too deep into the actual conquests, a brief word because it's been mentioned. I think we've mentioned it. Jihad. As per my earlier mentions, jihad had a different connotation before the full expansion of the Islamic conquests. Originally, it just means to strive or expenditure of effort, and it could refer to many efforts. It's actually mentioned very few times in the Quran as an overall. I think it's like 4 or 5 times. For example, a way in which it's used is striving against temptation, for example. It's it's worked out at the time when it appears that Arabs begin. This is also a perfect time to talk briefly, as we love to say, just for a little bit, about how when things come about, the time frame and the worldview with which they're brought in and used can change the connotations drastically. When it is mentioned to strive or to fight against temptation, that's taken one way. However, as the Arab conquests begin to roll faster and faster and faster, and there's this actual belief among Muslims that they will eventually control the whole of the earth. There is this belief that in the 7th and 8th century that they will control everything. And so what you're starting to see this morphing of terms and belief structures to better fit that worldview of an overall conquer, of holding the world to your will. This is important because when we talk about the succeeding caliphates, as you get further and further away from Muhammad, uh, the end of our discussion ends around 750. Muhammad will have been at this point been dead for almost 140 years. But this term moves and flows. Um, did anyone else have anything they want to add about the evolution of Islam or where it ends at his death?
Well, specifically about jihad, it's considered the sixth hidden pillar of Islam, not one of the five official pillars, but the sixth hidden. And you mentioned before the differences between what jihad is. It's a struggle and striving within yourself, and that's the greater jihad. And then holy war, the other jihad that we know it's considered the lesser jihad. So there's a greater and a lesser. So just for clarification and I guess emphasis on what that means.
No.
Yeah, that's a good point to make, especially to a Western audience, is when we talk about jihad for somebody that is actually a Muslim, it is not going to automatically mean going on a holy war. It's going to be fighting that war within
It's it's
yourself.
it's lost in translation. Yeah,
A
it's
It is.
lost in translation.
a
It's
perfect analogy that you can use is that before um, the Crusades actually started, there actually is no word for crusade in language. It doesn't exist. We actually create one. So, I mean, if you want a good connotation, like we think of Crusades is
Thanks,
so influential.
Christianity.
Oh boy. So actually, I guess you could say that jihad predates the Crusades because it does. But
Yeah.
there is no single word to describe holy war or a holy purpose in war or striving in Christianity, at least that I'm aware of. I could, of course, always be wrong on that one.
I would make an argument that most wars, for a very long time, probably were holy wars. That's just what war was. So that's an interesting idea.
I
When
mean,
did we
as a
have to say that it was a holy war instead of just being a regular war?
that's a, I mean, it's a good point. I get, but as I mentioned, Holy War wasn't created uh, with Islam. Definitely, we mentioned the Byzantium wars were definitely holy wars in every sense of the word for Christ and God,
Yeah. Um,
if that's how we're defining them.
Loosely, I guess we could describe them as that. Um, so because of that wrecking ball that's rolling through at this time of the seventh and eighth century, there's this idea that comes a bit called the House of Islam. Briefly, that means that all Muslims on Earth belong to this house, this family that exists. And for line you had it here in your notes, Ummah, is that
Yeah.
is the term for that. But there is also a second house. There is something called the House of War. Um, there is written multiple times in the record, for example, Muhammad is very clear, or not Muhammad, the writings are very clear that when you, for example, you make a treaty with a non-Muslim population, the maximum amount of time you can make a treaty for is 7 years. There is this moving forward spirit. One second. All right. Did anyone? So what you end up with is you have this constant striving, and this House of Islam idea is very important when you start getting into the caliphates that begin to fracture in the middle of the 8th century, because they all belong to the umbrella of Islam, this House of Islam, that they are trying to make the world fit um, their perceptions of and in their ideology and theology. Um, the power with which everyone draws inspiration from waxes and wanes over the succeeding centuries after Muhammad's death. It is constantly brought up to move things forward, or if some caliphates believe that they've striven too far away from Muhammad's teachings, they could actually say that they are no longer in the House of Islam. It's a very bad interpretation, but I guess you could say it's almost like being excommunicated. That is not a good one, but that's an example for a Western audience as to what that would mean to be kicked out of the House of Islam. Um, oh, did we lose Flying?
Sure, if she moved away voluntarily or what's going on.
Um, so I guess real quick, unless do you have anything to add to that, Lobo?
Before we get into the conquests?
Before we start getting into the actual pew pew.
No. Everything I have remaining is about the conquests and the aftermath of the conquests.
All right, so I guess we can begin with
Unless
the
there are any questions we can answer from
yes.
the audience.
Um, So one comment was the issue is that after Christianity and Islam, we don't see religion the same way that religion was seen before. I could agree with that statement. Prior to Christianity, religion and nation were linked. Yeah. So if you think of Rome, for example, you have the cult of Rome. It's done by the state. I believe Zoroastrianism is very similar. If you want to weigh on that one, Lobo.
Yeah, yes, Assassinate Empire was definitely that was the last Zoroastrian empire.
Yeah.
After the Arab conquest, there is no more Zoroastrianism. As I mean, it still exists, but it's no longer the religion of a state. Not even close.
Yeah. So while we wait for Flying, I guess I can briefly go over it. So one of the biggest reasons why, uh, yeah, so a holy war technically was a national war, I guess, according to this comment, which, so I guess that's supporting our,
A national war?
yeah, I mean, if a holy war, because if your religion is integrated so heavily with your state, if your state decides to go to war against somebody, technically, I guess you could call that a holy war. Um, the problem is that this gets dubious because, like,
My problem is that a state doesn't really, it's not really a nation, isn't really a thing until
right, there's
much
no such thing
later.
as a nation state. That's why I prefer the term the state or the copium. Like,
Because I mean, the Pope called for a crusade, but it ended up being lords that answered that call.
yeah, the barons and
There were no kings in the first crusade. It was all lords and barons and so forth.
yeah. Um, I guess we'll go ahead
Is
and
Feline coming back?
I'm sending her a message.
You're muted, Feline.
Sorry, Fox just got home from work.
Oh,
Uh,
I haven't seen him all day. I'm sorry.
that's all right. So we were getting ready to talk. Did you have anything else to say about Islam as a theology or religion or an idea right before we talk about the military and political conquest?
Nope,
Eh,
I'm ready to jump into that.
All right. So I want everyone to keep this in mind when we talk about this moving forward. Is that when an army or an invading force takes your land during this time frame, they don't just bring their rules. They bring their culture with them. And to us that seems very well duh. But at the same time you don't really we can't really understand that because that style of warfare doesn't really pervade today in our day of mass media and mass market. Cultures can expand beyond our national borders. And there is some fluidity on borders, but it when the Arabs conquer large sections of the world, around the Mediterranean world, they bring their Arabic culture with them, and that includes also the stuff that they picked up. So if they picked up a dish from the Persians and they liked it, they're going to change the name, maybe a few ingredients, and take them with them to modern day Morocco or Spain. One of the things I'd love to point out is that if anyone's had Spanish dishes, you know how important rice is. Rice is not grown in the Iberian Peninsula at this time before the Arabs show up. They bring that with them. Their knowledge on irrigation, because they're a desert dwelling people, help repair some of the Roman aqueducts that are there and get irrigation from the high places in the Iberian to the lower places to grow rice. So these kinds of things come with an invading society. So an invading society such as the Arabs did not just come and destroy things. I want to be very clear about that. We have this movieized version of how conquest works. And that does happen. But they bring with them all of their culture, good and bad, as well as their arts, sciences, and language. So I want to give that preface there. Did you two want to add anything to that?
sure. Yeah, it wasn't a conquest by the sword. It wasn't believe or die. The evidence does not suggest that at all. And as you said, the evidence does not suggest mass destruction of anything. The Quraysh tribe were very and the local elites in Mecca were very knowledgeable about agriculture, and there's no reason to suggest that they would destroy agriculture as they conquered. How else are you going to live off the land and provision your armies? And oftentimes they didn't even interact with the subjects that they conquered. They would build garrison cities. In fact, that was quite common to build garrison cities where they ruled outside of the city and let the local authorities continue ruling, assuming that they didn't resist in any way. And the speed of the conquests, and we're talking greasy fast speed here. We're talking over the course of 10 years, they've already taken Egypt after taking Syria and and into Persia as well. And very decisive, very quick battles. You don't spread that quickly if you have to take the time believe or die everyone.
If
They didn't care if you were Muslim. In fact, it was better if for them if you weren't Muslim. That way they could tax you.
Yeah, that tax is called the jizya. If you are a non-Muslim or a believer of you don't follow Islam, there was a special tax applied to you, and the income from this tax could be very substantial for certain caliphates and states at this time. Um, and if you two want to jump in on this one because this might expand out, the way the Arabs attacked a city is not how normally we would imagine it because in this era there you do have walled cities. Of course, this does exist. They've almost always existed, but a lot of times the army would show up to a medium-sized settlement and they would literally go up to the ruling leaders and say, "We can conquer you by force, or you can pay us." Um, it's not dissimilar to the Vikings, which are also becoming active in about a century from now, threatening to, you know, brutalize a town unless they pay them. The difference here is that they will take the town wherever you want them to or not, and then leave, as Lobo said, a small garrison force, and then move on. This giant moving, I don't want to use that term, giant, just rolling tide of I almost I almost compared it to a bug
Oh,
or a
and then
swarm.
they weren't even that large. They typically went up against larger forces. They were just organized and highly motivated and easy to provision and easy to unite under
It
one
it
goal.
it is
That
incredibly
goes
to
back to that tribal mentality that they've just been working
uh
off of this whole time.
But yeah,
so
you're right that they didn't do siege warfare. They didn't deal with siege warfare at all. They did hit and run
Very skirmish
tactics.
warfare.
yeah, if
Yeah.
they came across a city they couldn't crack, there's always one way to get rid of a medieval city or early medieval city. You just starve it. Wait. The Arab conquest, the conquerors, they are used to traveling through the Arabian Peninsula, one of the harshest places on Earth overall. And while they did have oases and they knew the land a little bit better, North Africa, that's easy for them. Levant, that's easy for them. Where they start running into some real interesting issue is in southern Francia, which is modern day France, and they start seeing some things like, camels don't do so hot in southern France as they do in North Africa, for example.
What are you
But
talking about? They love snow.
And yeah, and up into the northern Levant. That was a wall for a long time that they couldn't get through.
yeah, it should be mentioned that uh, horse, quick movements, and being able to fade away. If they were losing a fight, they really just go nope, and they would leave. They would not stay. They would leave. Uh, because of the rating structure they had before, as Feline had made mention of, a lot of scouting. They were pernicious in their level of tracking your caravans because usually they were the ones bringing caravans to this section of the world, so they knew when the caravanning season was, and if they're about to attack a city, they would just take your goods bound for that city and run off with it, and then sell it, and then use the money to, buy you off. It's it's really loose. It's a lot of fun. Uh,
That's one word for it.
well, we have in our Western thought and what in the Western idea of just this horde of horsemen, like
And it
the
wasn't.
Rohan
They
of
were on
like ten
camels.
thousand people coming down. You need to go about 500, 600 years in the future with the Turks in the Balkans to get that kind of level of force.
Now, what I have in my notes is that the numbers for the Arab armies were in the low thousands.
That
Yeah, they were really, really small armies. Their best leader was Khalid al-Walid, and he was known for going into a fight that everybody thought he was going to lose, and he never did. He just kept winning fights. He kept
he,
winning fights up until the day that Muhammad died and he got removed from power. He was actually in the middle of a siege when they got the news that Muhammad died, and they're like, "We're gonna let him finish his business and then tell him."
don't interrupt the master. He's got this.
Yeah, no, well, he got removed from power because somebody from a different tribe took over, but they're like, we're gonna let him have that.
So when discussing also how they expanded so quickly. We've already kind of laid it out, like how weak the surrounding regional powers were at this time. But also, I cannot, in good conscience, not mention that zealotry plays a lot into this. The religion and the idea of Islam holds the coalition of forces together. It holds these tribes together. You only need to look at letters and surviving dispatches we have between, say, Byzantium and small kingdoms in the Levant, those buffer kingdoms that we were talking about earlier. They sneered down on the those that lived in the Arabian Peninsula. And there is a famous quote that I do not have in front of me where when the Arabs conquered a satrap in Persia, they made a mention to the ruler at the time of, we were a despicable people that you looked down upon. Now we had a prophet who raised us up, or something to that effect. So to see the psychological movement here, it is not to be undervalued how much belonging to a collective whole allows you to do more. Knowing that that your children and your friends are protected, and this faith protects you. We keep coming back and back in this show over and over again about how important religion is in this time frame. Christianity, Islam, Judaism are incredibly powerful forces, and do not take them lightly. They are very powerful in this time frame, so we can't discount zealotry. But it also shouldn't be taken to the extreme. I'm sure you can think of 1,000 ways in which that can be taken badly, but
No,
it
I think when you hear zealotry, you think automatically it has a negative connotation,
right.
and it makes people think of the believe or die type of conquest. And I'm sorry, you wanted to keep talking.
No. That's perfect. You actually
No,
just
cut him off.
you know. I need to be cut off from time to time. I can just
No, and
rant.
they didn't even. There's no evidence to suggest they targeted non-Muslims. And oftentimes, like you mentioned before, if they could cut a deal with the leader, they would cut that deal. They didn't.
Absolutely.
We want
Why,
to rule.
why
We
would
don't
you
want to
waste
fight.
those resources? Yeah.
Yeah.
And
Who would do that?
what's funny is when you're talking about the area around Medina and Mecca and all these areas, if you were a non-believer there, you were under a very strict rule set. A matter of fact, I believe Muhammad actually pushed the Jews out in one of the cities. Was that Mecca?
It was Medina.
He
No, it
actually
was Medina.
Medina. He drove. I mean, he
Yeah.
drove every other one else that wasn't Islam out,
Yeah,
very harshly.
that was a very, you need to convert or you need to leave or we're gonna kill you.
Yeah. So again, I don't want to say that it waffles, but it evolves. You see these as you become responsible for more and more territory and more subjects, you have to moderate your stance, because as if you do that, believe or die, you're gonna lose a lot of resources. Who's gonna farm for you? Who's gonna maintain your caravans for it?
Yeah, but that was so early on, and it's
Right.
one of the very, very few examples of him
That,
actually doing
that's
that.
during
And
the political strife of Medina. There was
yeah,
a lot of political strife there.
Yeah.
yeah, I think it was just a very specific situation for Medina that
I think he'd
needed
fallen under
that.
the idea that the Jews in Medina were out to get him and working for the Meccan elites, and he expelled them for that reason.
Yep. Because just as in Europe, Jews are heavily involved with trading, accounting, and other means because of their contacts in Europe, especially Italy. Um, the Jews are the people of the city. In some languages, they're referred to in this time. So when they push into the Levant and they take Jerusalem, for example, they don't go through slaughtering the Jews. That's a myth, and that actually, ironically, is used later on in later centuries when the Crusaders come over, saying that the Arabs robbed us of our chance to kill the Jews because they killed them all, which is not accurate at all, because when the Crusaders arrive, there still happens to be Jews there. We They forgot, or they would like to forget, that they were still there. Still do, to some extent. Um,
You're not wrong.
so I guess I wanted to derail it here for a second, and talk a little bit about these cultures that exist in the area, like the Assyrians, the uh, because we love to paint with broad brushes in history, and with the current movements that are happening today of I think it's the nativism. I hate that term because I always think of like certain other types of nativism,
I feel
but
you.
if you have a different term, please help me use it. But where indigenous societies are taking their quote unquote land back or their culture back or society back. So I feel that not mentioning some of the pre-existing um, societies that do exist at this time is a disservice. The Coptics are a classic example in Egypt at this time.
Hmm.
As I mentioned, the Assyrian Christians. We've mentioned the Ethiopians. Um, e- uh, e- uh, Ethiopian Jews are very prevalent this time.
Armenian
Armenian.
Christians.
So keep in mind that whenever we talk about a region or space, that there are sometimes thousands of variations of that inside of that area, especially something as large as the Sassanid Empire and the Byzantine. Although Byzantine tends to be a little bit more homogenized than, at least until the Bulgars and Slavs come down from the north, it tends to be a little bit more homogenized.
Still
Um,
not a monolith, though. There's
it,
still a lot going on.
nope. So, if did you guys have anything you wanted to add on the Arabic influence on these nativist areas and how it affected their societies
Um,
before we
I
move on?
I can say that, since it wasn't a conquest of believe or die, these cultures ended up. I mean, Coptics in Egypt still exist today, and a lot of the groups you mentioned still exist. Like Syrian Christians, Armenian Christians, and they pretty much existed as they always had. The infrastructures remain the same. It was just under different rulership now, and sometimes, not all the time, they preferred Muslim rulership because of their treatment under the Byzantine rulers. They were more persecuted under Byzantines than under Muslims. Not in all cases, but in some cases
Yeah,
that's true. And not all two no two situations were the same. Everywhere the Arabs went, it was a different situation they had to deal with.
yeah, because a an early Christian heretical movement is treated harshly by the Byzantines versus the Muslims because they just look at you and go, "You're a Christian.
You do you, boo.
Yeah, you're no different than this Christian over here." Whereas this is an Orthodox, you're a Cathar or whatever. They don't care. Well, that's a little bit
I mean,
later.
that's exactly the way that people looked at Islam up from the outside too, though. That's just the way it goes.
I got those broad brushstrokes.
Yeah. I mean, if you think about the way that even today the West approaches Islam and the views that it takes on it, it really like America just loves to be, oh, you're in the Middle East, you're Muslim, ha ha ha. The Islam that we find in, say, Malaysia is going to be so drastically different than the that we would find in Afghanistan.
So I know
So
generally our audience can make the distinction between Arab and Muslim,
I
but
would hope so.
but just for those who are unaware, not all Arabs are Muslims and not all Muslims are Arabs. They're
Most
Well,
Muslims are not Arabs.
they aren't. That's correct. There aren't enough
Indonesian?
people in Arabia for that.
Yeah.
Yeah, like Indonesia is a Muslim country. They're the fourth largest country on the planet, and Iran has 80 million people, not Arabs.
Yeah.
Afghanistan, not
Yep.
Arabs. People in North
Yep.
Africa. I mean, Arab is also sort of a term that can get tossed around a lot with because people in Syria would consider themselves Arabs. People in Egypt would consider themselves Arabs. Moroccans would consider themselves Arabs.
I would.
Or
It's definitely more of a cultural approach than a religious approach. I so Christianity is this really weird thing where the other two religions, you can be of that religion culturally, you
An
can be of that
ethnoculture?
religion through birth, or you could be that culture through actual practice of religion. So there's Jewish people and there's Muslim people who don't actually practice, but they are that way because they were born that way. Um, but Christians who are born Christians who don't practice don't consider themselves Christian anymore. Like it's not in the blood. Whereas with Muslims and Jews, it is.
I'd say more so with Jews, just
Same.
because
Way more with Jews.
Because being a Jew is also an ethnicity.
Absolutely. Being
Yeah.
Muslim is not an ethnicity.
It's incredible the amount of uh, differences that you find among certain segments.
Okay, we
Where were
totally
we?
got derailed.
Yep.
I,
Yep.
I love that. I love that conversation of you could be religiously something and you could be culturally something, and sometimes those two don't mix at all. That's also a really strong distinction to make. And usually, when I think about the Arabic world, I'm thinking of that Middle Eastern culture that spawned from the Arabian Peninsula. Whereas if you start talking about Islam, there's so much more to it than that. Much like Christianity. Like you would never look at Christianity and be like, "Oh, that's just an Arabic religion." It's not. You would never look at Islam and say, "Oh, that's just an Arabic religion." It's not. It's so
Some
much more
people,
now.
some
Yeah.
people do consider it a religion of the Arabs, and it's only Arabs.
They should do the research.
And Arab, and even Arab itself can be a political term. If you think about the
That's very
19th,
true.
20th century with Pan-Arabism and the
Mm-hmm.
Pan-Arabist movement, the Arab League, which involved countries all the way from West Africa to
That is true.
Iraq. So
That's very true. All right.
Yep.
Where were we?
we were just on the lip of talking about the actual conquest itself. We were just kind of giving ourselves some addendums and side
Are, are we
socio-political.
still in the build-up?
Well, we finished the build-up.
Oh, okay.
We've
We're
left the
there.
station. We are
An
able to
hour
talk
and
about.
15 minutes.
Hey, it's a big chunk of material.
No, it's good that we talked about all of this. It happened really fast. There, we're done.
All right, all right. So, um, the powers that be, that would be the Sassanids and the other regional powers at the time, they had no idea the storm that was brewing ahead of them within 2 decades of the end of the war between the Byzantines and the Persians would be utterly destroyed. The Byzantine holdings would effectively be overrun, and in less than one lifetime, the Arabs had carved out an empire that ran from the Atlantic Ocean to the Himalayas in India. This is such an immense territory. Um, so, moving through it, and we'll dig a little deeper here when we move through it, but in just moving through like Persia, for example, Persia is initially attacked, as I said, in 633. Right after they thought they could get their feet out from under themselves after the horrible civil war they had just dealt with. However, our modern pop culture belief of the Persian Empire's collapse is one of just, and they're done. That's not accurate. The Persians actually put up at least initially, a decent fight. They do lose some of the richest and most important central regions, like around Iraq, modern day Iraq. However, when they're pulled out during one of the periods where they're attacking the Byzantines in the Levant, the Persians do counterattack and successfully take everything back, and that takes about 3 years to kick back. In round two, however, of this in 636, they continue to punch and punch and punch the Sassanid Empire until its full dissolution in 651. But when we talk about speed of collapse, and the rest of these, and I'll let everyone else jump in here. Please do. When we talk about the speed of the collapse, we it should be mentioned that they didn't take these places over in like a year. All right, they took over all of Sassanid Empire. It took them almost 20 years to do, from 633 to 651. So, but when we're talking about overall strategy here, that's still extremely quick.
That's super fast. That's ridiculously quick. Like I originally mentioned at the beginning, Islam started with 22 people in a basement in Mecca. Probably not a basement. I don't think they had them. But you know what I mean. And 20
no, the
years
basements would have
later,
caved in.
yeah, that's the wrong. It's all sand there. Bad for basements. But yeah, so 22 people, 20 years later, you have conquered the entirety of Arabia. That's insane.
Yeah, just conquering
And
Arabia alone. Yeah.
Yeah, and punching toe to toe with the regional powers that had held sway there for half a millennia, and in the case of the Byzantines, a legacy of an empire that was at that point almost 1,000 years old. The Sassanids have a history going almost as far back. Uh, I it cannot be discounted the amount that if the Arabs had broke out of Arabia a century earlier or a century later. If you want to get, I think their time of it. This is my personal belief that they might have still been successful, but it would have been much more difficult. They just attacked at literally the perfect time for these regional powers to just go, oh shit.
I agree, absolutely. Everything else that was going on in the region just allowed them to kind of slip in through the back doors, like we were talking about with the scavenging fighting. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, and that's not to discount them in any way. It's just often uh, changes in history are due to just good timing or luck, as you said earlier.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Um, in the Levant, Jerusalem falls in 638. Egypt, the jewel and the crown of Byzantines, falls in 646. Um, that is a failure of such catastrophic occurrence that the one could argue that the Byzantine never ever recover from this. They lose with the loss of Egypt or the breadbasket and the Levant in the loss of like Egypt and Antioch and a couple other cities at this time.
Damascus in
Dem-
636,
six.
which
Yeah,
became the capital of the caliphate 25 years later.
yeah. It I I mean I'm almost struggling for words. I just can't describe to you like how insane that is. Egypt had been under control of the Romans and before them the Greeks since almost time immemorial, all the way back to the ancient Egyptians. They had always been under control, and now a regional power had just taken them away from people across the Mediterranean Sea, and so it's shocking.
Yeah, so what's interesting about Egypt is that they haven't controlled themselves for most of their history that we know of. Like they were in control of themselves in ancient Egypt, and then after that it was Romans, Greeks,
Like Mark
Romans.
Anthony.
It wasn't until the British left in the 20th century
Yeah,
that Egypt had autonomy again.
that's got to be a record. That has to be a record of like the longest period of time with no autonomy.
I was about to say, have you met India? But uh, no, no, India is not that bad.
India's
I
a
think Egypt's
special.
worse. We'll
the
talk about India
the
one day,
the
and I'm gonna
the,
cry. It's gonna make me so happy.
the Indus Valley region is just nuts.
That's
Um,
Pakistan, man. We're talking
oh,
about
yeah,
India.
right. In India, the subcontinent.
I didn't mean to sidetrack the conversation. It's
Oh, you're
Oh,
fine.
don't do
Egypt's
not
always
get
a
me started
fascinating time.
on the Indus Valley. I won't shut up. Okay.
So bring it back. Constantinople gets attacked 3 times in 640 or 674, 717, and 718. At this time, they continually and constantly lose large sections of Asia Minor, Levant. You have this back and forth between them at this time. But you can see it every year. The Byzantines lose holds or strengths, and as we talked about earlier about how the Arab conquest conquers, that also holds true for the Byzantines. Although they do have a state army and they are able to march in and lay siege to cities, but if they're generally retaking a city from the Arabs, they would just attack the outskirts and then have to deal with the garrison inside. So when retaking a city, they have a harder time than the Arabs did getting in. So it slows this progress back and forth. And I'm sure there's always exceptions to that on both sides, but that some of these major cities like Antioch, especially, they are brutal slogs. Um, so the
I
North
mean,
Africa. Go ahead.
Justinian decided Antioch on purpose to be just a slog to conquer. So I
Oof.
didn't interrupt you. I'm sorry.
No, no, you're good. Actually, if you want to bring that up into North Africa, the entirety of North Africa falls in mostly the 690s and early 700s. So if you want to think about from Egypt to modern day Morocco, that falls in less than 15 years. Um, Again, very sparsely populated, perfect territory for the Arabs to roll through because of their, their intrinsic, their home turf, as it were, extends through that region.
Yeah,
Um,
by the early 7th century, They had already reached Spain and Central Asia and the Sindh Valley in Pakistan.
Yeah, I we I guess the to better for a Western audience to understand the scale would be the everyone talked about Alexander the Great, and he did it, in his one lifetime. But think of how short-lived his empire was, and how long-lived some of these caliphates became. Um, it shows you the integration that the Arabs brought with them into this House of Islam, because after Alexander's death, all those things broke apart and they returned to their uh, native style. They had some Hellenic influence, but the Arabs bring a much heavier influence with them. Um, okay. Um, so when they conquer the Northern Africa and they completely surround the bottom half of the Mediterranean, Europe at this time is, and Christendom is almost in a state of panic at this time. They have lost full contact with the Silk Road unless it goes through very certain channels, um, and their people are paying more. Right about at the end of this discussion, around 750, you start getting the development of this thing that we've talked about before called the Northern Arc, with the Vikings that starts to go through. That becomes so vital because the Arab caliphates control the Mediterranean. The Mediterranean, especially in the east section, the from the Balkans east, is fully controlled by Arab forces. They generally do not allow Christian traders without paying large bribes and fees. This waxes and wanes, of course, depending on how Byzantium's doing at the time. But because Byzantium is still held in Constantinople, they're able to still do trade through the Black Sea and etc. out through China. So it's not really cutting off of Europe. But when they take the Iberian Peninsula and convert it later into the Kingdom of Al-Andalus, that is bad for Europe, because the kingdoms there are not prepared. They cannot hold against this, and due to an advantage of natural terrain, they call it the Pyrenees Mountains, helps contain them for a while. But Arabic raiders into East, no, West Francia around this time become a problem, and we start seeing the first real interactions between the Northern European tradition and the Islamic tradition coming into clash here. But real quick before we go into that far, I wanted to talk about iconoclasm, since that
Oh
seems
yeah.
to go along there. Would you like to talk about iconoclasm?
Yes. So we were talking earlier about how Jesus was considered a prophet. Um, the in the Islamic tradition, visual representation of Allah or the prophets is verboten. It is considered. I'm trying to think of the best way to put that. Humans can never recreate their divine being, so it is forbidden to attempt it. Um, so Jesus, being a prophet, when Islam arrives in the Byzantine Empire and sees what they have been doing with Jesus, they are probably horrified. I mean, I'm a little horrified too. If you've ever seen a Byzantine church, they are beautiful beyond imagine. There is gold everywhere. There's representations of Jesus and Mary. There's saints everywhere. But that is so uh, counterintuitive to the way that Islam wants to worship their God that there's actually higher ups in the Byzantine Christian church that would like to court the Muslims so that they don't come and tear down their cities. So that's when Leo the Third, the Pope, think it was 726 was the first iconoclasm of Byzantine. Leo the Third's like, we're just gonna get rid of all of this iconography. It's gonna be great. Tell your friends we're getting rid of it. We're going straight just back to worship, back to our roots. Uh, the nobles hate it. because they've spent a lot of time and a lot of money to build shrines and acquire artifacts from the saints, bones and whatnot. They don't want to get rid of it. That's how they worship. They have shrines to Mary, and they have shrines to saints, and they have shrines to Jesus, and they can't have some other religion coming in and telling them what to do. So this is one of the many clashes between the Eastern and the Western Church. So the Eastern Church is going to be considered Rome. No, sorry, reverse that. I know what the directions are. So the Western Church is going to be considered Rome. I don't know if you've met a Catholic lately, but they like Mary and they like the representations of their saints. So the Western Church is suitably horrified. The Eastern Church says we're going to do our own thing, and the lay people are caught in between. The poor people actually quite like this because it's expensive to have shrines, so they don't have any. And between, what are my dates? Between 726 and 787, the churches in Byzantine remove all religious symbols and venerations. People actually rioted. I'm a little proud. Yeah. So it's billed as a defensive mechanism against Islam by the Eastern Church, so that they can more easily coexist, which I would argue with for sure, knowing what we know about the way Islam deals with other cultures. It's probably the easiest way for them not to get overrun, and they were probably really smart to do it. And that
Yeah,
was the first iconoclasm.
yeah, and that portends great problems for Christianity in much or not too much later, actually. The Great
Real
Schism,
quick,
and it's a pretty
real
nasty
quick.
one.
That it really is like the death keel between having, how many popes were there then? Because there was Leo, and then there was, who was the pope in Rome at the time? We didn't have 3 popes yet, but we definitely
No,
had
yeah,
2.
no, that happens during the Babylonian exile in the oh man, Par's gonna kill me. I think it's like the
Fine.
14th century. I want to say the 1300s. I want to say.
Yeah.
So we're
Like
not there yet.
I don't want to give too much away, because when we start talking about
Spoilers! Oh my god.
I know, spoilers. I'm really excited about us talking about the Goths. That's going to be super fun. So the time after the Goths, when we start talking about the Carolingian Empire and what preceded that, or what came after that. But this is definitely like a major pivot point in Eastern European history for sure. Up until this point, it was just building and building and building on this wealth and this idea of bigger, better, faster, stronger. Sorry,
So
it's gonna be stuck in my head for the rest of the night. But
since you already
it's definitely the pivot point.
since you mentioned the Goths, I should also mention that those that because I mentioned earlier, but I just want to remind everybody, the people that the Arabs are conquering during this time frame are the barbarian kingdoms that took Rome, and they were talking about the Vandals, the Ostrogoths, the Visigoths. Important factors here. These kingdoms tried to, as much as possible, maintain the level of infrastructure and their societal structure from Rome to some varying degrees of success. The Vandals are the first ones to get just kicked to the curb when they roll through northern Africa. The Visigoths in Spain get what's coming to them a little bit later. And actually, to give you an idea of how successful Arabic, the language, is at this time, is that there are very few Visigothic words left in modern Spanish. Very few. But there's a lot of Arabic words in Spanish today, owing to the fact of total conquest. So, as far as like the conquests themselves, do we have any more information we want to share about how they proceeded, how they stalled out, when, and any struggles or triumphs they might have had along the way?
That's all you.
Um, what's it?
That's all you.
Oh,
I
no
don't think I had
problem.
any notes on that.
Um, Yeah, well, I mean, a lot of people became very rich very quickly. Um, so the lands of the elites that they conquered fell into the hands of the conquerors. The spoils and the booty. Um, the third caliph, Umar, he kept 1/5 of the lands for himself and gave the rest to his soldiers.
Uh,
Um,
Actually, perfect. We missed the opportunity. Do you want to explain the caliphate like progression from this caliphate to this caliphate to this caliphate? Because we've brought it up a few times and we've used different terms like Abbasids and Umayyads, and we haven't really made a distinguishment there yet.
sure. I'll do a brief note on it. So we had the four rightly guided caliphs, the first four. Well, after Muhammad, so you had Abu Bakr, Uthman, Omar, Ali. Those are your first four rightly guided caliphs. Ali is killed. Well, he's killed because they thought he killed Umar. It's because of just succession drama. Um, so then, after Ali was killed, that's when you get the real big Sunni Shia split because Ali has children and they have the blood of the Prophet. And according to Shia tradition, it passes down through the bloodline, the caliphate. But they didn't have the political power that the Quraysh tribe still had. They still had a lot of power in the Muslim world, and Muawiyah was the next caliph. He actually claimed caliph for himself, which he sort of broke with tradition and did that. And Muawiyah ended up becoming the first caliph of the Umayyad Caliphate, which is based out of Damascus, Syria. And they lasted, I don't know the exact years when it fell. I know that the Abbasid Caliphate eventually took it over. But Muawiyah ended up taking out Hussein, which was Ali's son, Muhammad's grandson, in the Battle of Karbala, which became this cataclysmic moment with the Sunni Shia split, which has never really reconciled since then. And eventually, you get a Shia caliphate in Egypt, the Fatimid Caliphate, which rises up to challenge the Sunni majority. And the Umayyad Caliphate eventually falls to the Abbasid Caliphate, which becomes more Persianite in its traditions and its governance. In fact, it's less Arab. The Abbasid Caliphate is far more Persian. You have a Persian authorities, Persian structures, Persian culture, Persian learning. You get the house of house of knowledge in Baghdad. Baghdad becomes the capital of the Abbasid Caliphate. It shifts from Damascus over to Baghdad,
The
and
golden age of knowledge.
Fatimid Caliphate, it's Cairo becomes the capital, and this is the aftermath of having to try to maintain a large land empire. And this eventually happens to all land empires, right? They all eventually just fracture among themselves. And it was about in the 8th or 9th century when it started happening to the Islamic Empire, the Caliphate. It just started fracturing into smaller caliphates. And the Umayyad Caliphate didn't actually go away after they were run out of town by the Abbasids. They went to Spain. The surviving caliph from the Umayyad Caliphate went to Spain, started a new Umayyad Caliphate, which became Al-Andalus. I'm not sure if that's what you wanted me to talk
No,
about.
that's
What's
perfect.
interesting about Muawiyah and Marwan, which he was the caliph that came after Muawiyah, he made his caliphate far more Byzantine in its structure. And he actually printed coins and adopted their architecture style. So, as much as you see an Arab Islamization and Arabization of the regions, you also see them adopting the regional traditions as well, and the regional styles and cultures.
Yeah, they whenever and I think it's like our fifth time mentioning it. Whenever there's a conqueror and they move through, it becomes a mixing pot of cultures. Because, for example, if I'm invading Islamic force, I take over a town that's full of Jews and Christians. If there's a suppression going on, like say if the Jews are being suppressed by the Christians, I put a stop to that. I don't want unrest in my city. And by definition, I have forced a new structure for the cultures to mix further, and I'm adding my own flavor to it. Take that to the extreme and imagine it over, the entire Mediterranean world. You get some pretty interesting stuff.
Yeah, it's a term called acculturation, where you come in and you take their culture and kind of adapt it to what you're doing with your own. So there's less strife, and you're not mandating that they follow your culture carte blanche. You're adapting it. It's like Easter. Everybody talks about Ostara, and how it was translated into the Christian holiday Easter, which is yes and no, but that's kind of an example.
My wife was just commenting that she's never seen you with not being a lizard, Lobo, so she was confused as to who you were. So moving through, coming towards the end here, I am not going to go into too much detail on here because a very particular member that we use a lot on the show would be upset if I went into too many details. But it should be mentioned that the fear and strife in Europe after the conquering of the Iberian Peninsula is extreme. There's current massive movements to get people together to kick them out, to get them out of Europe. And this proves to be very difficult in southern France, modern day France. And one does manage to do it by the name of Charles Martel, known as the Hammer. And he earns that name after his favorite weapon. He's considered the savior of the West by turning back the Muslims at the Battle of Tours. And a very important note here, because if you recognize that name, you should. Or if you don't recognize that name, you should, because he's the grandfather of a person that's extremely important to Western history, and that is Charlemagne.
That important.
Yeah.
He was.
We're talking, and because of how the history plays out, one can only imagine the difference things would have taken had the Arabs killed Charles Martel, or if he had been unsuccessful and not gained notoriety for this feat. So it's a fantastic what-if question of if Charles Martel had been unsuccessful, would Western Europe have its current flavor today? That is a never-ending and never-ceasing what-if, and it's one of the fun ones.
It is a fun one.
But on a closing note here, for me, and I'll let you guys do your own closing. We've talked a lot about the Arab conquest as not just a physical one, not of swords, but of ideas. And nothing better articulates this better than a person by the name most of the people who take Latin would know him as Averroes. And if you're looking at the notes, if one of you two wants to pronounce the name, his Arabic name.
Oh man, Abu
Where's it at?
Wali Muhammad Im Ahmed Im Rushd. That's terrible.
Yeah,
Yeah, it's in the Google Doc.
Abu Walid Muhammad ibn Ahmad ibn Rushd.
There you go.
Yeah. So this individual is important because later in society, we're talking about during the scholastic era. It's a school of thought for religion that is not pertinent to the current discussion, but know that Western Europe thinkers, and these eventually would go on to be in universities and interpret modern thought. They use the workings of this individual to the extent that is not really understandable today. What was this person commenting on? It wasn't his own works initially. He had translated Aristotle from Greek to Arabic, and then because Al-Andalus, or modern-day Spain, down the Iberian Peninsula, had become the land of three religions, that mixing there allowed him to then it got translated then into Latin and then spread throughout Europe. And the reason why this is important is because it allows more and more people to come into contact with Aristotle and his works. This is so important, but also dangerous, because if you remember our discussion about how these religions view each other, the idea that monks and monasteries could be using pagan stuff is already not a great idea. They touch with it a little bit, like Cicero, to keep good Latin, But if they ever found out that they were using a translation done by an Arab or a Muslim, it gets a little more difficult. And he is mentioned in these texts as the commentator. So they will say something along the lines of, Aristotle means this, and I think the commentator is correct. That gives you an idea of how highly placed Arabic ideas, culture, and influences become during this time frame. This is the Arabic Golden Age, in the just after the period where we're talking about, of geometry and mathematics and stuff. So I want to end my portion of today's show with the idea that when we talk about conquest, I want you always to maintain the idea that you don't bring your sword with you, you bring your entire culture with you. It's good, it's bad, and it mixes with what's already there. Unless you kill everybody, then then it's only you. But I'm gonna let Lobo and Feline give their closing thoughts, arguments, suppositions, and general rantings.
I'll build upon what you were saying about what conquest actually means for the world, and people often look at, I mean, maybe not often, but there is the idea that Arabs and Islam are inherently backwards, and if they were to, and if they conquer some place, it inherently goes backwards centuries, But you didn't see that, as you mentioned. Averroes became a highly decorated translator of the classics, and translation of the classics didn't just take place in Al-Andalus; it took place in the Abbasid Caliphate as well, in Baghdad, in the House of Knowledge. That's where you get advancements in astronomy, and you get more developments in scientific. I mean, not science as we know it from Francis Bacon, but their own version of science. And you mentioned geometry, and you get the development of algebra. Algebra is an Arabic word. Algebra, that's Arab. That was developed by Arabs, and there was a whole movement to translate Greek classics to Arabic because they wanted to preserve that knowledge and build their own knowledge with it, compounding upon it. And there's the idea that those classics wouldn't even exist today if Arabs hadn't preserved them and translated them. And I'm jumping a bit ahead, but when you get to the Crusades, that's when you get more of this interaction and more of these classics, and that's why it's called the Dark Ages in Europe, because they've been cut off from the world for so long that now they're being reintroduced to the new developments that have taken place in their absence. I mean, I know that's a simplified way of explaining that, but I'll go ahead and pass it along to Feline.
Yay.
I was gonna say all the exact same things. It's amazing to see what Islam brought to the world, particularly our world that we know and live today. Um, there's so many things we use in a day to day that are a direct result of Islam's dedication to art, science, and knowledge. Um, and we'll talk about that. I hope. I hope one day we'll actually sit down and talk about the Arabic Renaissance, the 11th and 12th century. We'll talk about the founding of colleges and modern medicine and hospitals. But for today's talk, I think the most important salient um, point I would definitely like to make is that it's not it's not this crazy scary monolith. It is literally a group of 22 people that started in the desert, that were outcast from their hometown, that built an entire crazy big religion just based on the building blocks that was already there. Desert people are some of the most amazing and resourceful cultures you're ever going to find in this whole wide world, because they have to fight tooth and nail for literally everything. And it's one of the things that's always drawn me to desert dwelling cultures, is just the many ways that they figure out how to live in such terrible, terrible conditions, because they are terrible. The desert's a terrible place to live. Do not recommend. 0 of 10 stars at all times. One of the very coolest research projects I ever did was researching oral storytelling within the Bedouin tribe, and to this day, will carry on the traditions of oral storytelling and poetry that they were participating in 7th century Arabian Peninsula. So the same sorts of stories that they were telling pre-Islam, they're still telling to this day all over the world in many parts due to Islam. So it's a beautiful religion. It's an ugly religion. But it's just, at the end of the day, it's just a religion like all the others. It has its high notes and its low notes, and it's good to think about it as that tiny little baby thing that had to be grown. I think it's really important to remember that because Christianity started that way. I'm not going to say Judaism started that way because it just kind of sprung up because it's tradition, I think. Like all major
Tradition.
religions. Yeah, like all major religions, it started with a crazy guy, an idea out in the middle of nowhere. So don't be rough on Islam. I'll come beat you up.
And don't judge Islam by recent developments in the 20th and 21st century, because those are often reactions to other developments in the
American
world.
imperialism.
Not just
I'm
American,
sorry,
but
what?
like British imperialism, French imperialism, and that can be a whole nother discussion on its own.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
I
But we're not getting into that.
No, no.
I do find it funny, I guess, out of addendum, is that religions a lot of times seem to be found by those individuals between the ages of 30 and 40 and tend to be men. So what I'm hearing is I still have a future to develop
Yeah,
a world-conquering religion.
I still believe in
So,
you.
so for those of you out there that are between the ages of 30 and 40 and you're wondering what you need to do with your life as a post-colonial, make a religion, take the world by
was
storm.
how old was
Please
Hubbard?
don't.
How
Oh, he
wrong?
was old enough. He was in his 50s, I think.
But when did he write his books, which
I don't
became the
know.
basis? Hmm.
70s.
But but I really appreciate everyone tuning in. We're
Thanks for hanging
back.
out, Lobo.
Yeah,
Oh, no problem. Anytime.
It's so good to spend
um
time with you.
if
You too. I miss you.
if Lobo enjoys what he's been done today and wants to agree to come back, anytime we talk about Arabic culture, I think
Yeah,
we'll be
any
pulling,
Ottoman
especially
Empire, any
Crusades.
like I can slide into anywhere. Like my general knowledge is Middle East. I can slide in anywhere you need me. I'll be
Um,
useless in Europe. Useless in Europe, so don't even ask.
oh, you can
Except
visit.
Crusades. If you Crusades, I
There you
can.
go.
Yeah.
It's gonna be like a 3-part series on the Crusades. It's gonna have to
Uh,
be.
I honestly think the Crusades are going to be like this spiraling of insanity. Um,
Fine. We're gonna
Yeah,
have 8
it's
people
very
on
very
here.
Crusade like.
It is.
It's
but
very Deus Voltivus.
so what you're saying is the first one was great, and then just slowly loses cohesion as it moves forward.
Yes. That's kind of exactly how it happened.
They kind of just like failed upwards in the first Crusade. Just
Oh man, because when you talk about the People's Crusade and Baron's Crusade, man, what a world.
well, the Islamic world was very disunified at the time. But
So
we'll get to that.
on a fantastic closing note, because I know it's like a third closing note. A fantastic closing note is that the Arabic world is as disjointed and in disunity as the Persians and the Persians are at the outset when the Crusades start. They're not as disunified, but they're there. That luckiness that we've been talking about, that also strikes them too in the reverse. So with that, I appreciate everyone coming in and joining us, and look forward to our next episode next month, and we will get back to you on what that topic will be. But I have a feeling it's going to be interesting no matter what. So
That'd be great.
thanks everyone, and have a good night.